Good afternoon, everybody. You're all very welcome to the last masterclass of 2020. My name is Melanie Crowley. I am the head of Mason Hayes and Curran's Employment and Benefits Practice. I am a lawyer. I am a mother. I am a team manager, and I am a COVID struggler. I am delighted that you have joined us today, and I'm delighted also to be joined by Dr. Melrona Curran, I apologise. Melrona is the Associate Professor of Organisational Psychology in DCU. She is a registered psychologist, and she lectures in DCU predominantly in the area of organisational psychology. Melrona is DCU's representative on the 30% club, and those of you familiar with Mason Hayes and Curran will have come across Melrona before, because she's spoken both to our own internal staff and to many of our clients on really interesting things like inclusion and diversity in the workplace. But today we're here to talk about the management and the personal challenges of COVID living and working, and the realities of what we have all been through for the last number of months. We're going to talk about goal setting, and we're going to talk about being realistic, and we're going to talk about some psychological resilience and strength and communications and how to manage those. Melrona, you're very welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm very excited to get stuck in. But before we do, I just want to say two things around housekeeping. First of all, for those of you who registered early, you will have received a set of slides. We're not going to put those up, but there's some really interesting detail in those. And for anybody who didn't get them, we'll send them afterwards. But we're going to talk around some of the stats and some of the issues that are in those slides. We also have a Q&A function, and we've got put aside plenty of time for some questions and answers. And I'm hoping that there will be many questions and answers. I have loads myself. I've talked to Melrona through a few of those when we've been preparing for this. But if any of you have questions or issues that you'd like us to address, please put them into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So Melrona, thank you again. We've all been at home since March. We got a little bit of respite during the summer, thank God. I got down to Galway to see my folks. We all took a few days off. We discovered Ireland. It was great. But we're back down in lockdown. We're in week 4. We have another couple of weeks left. I consider myself to be fairly optimistic and fairly strong, but I have to say that I think anybody I talk to, I'm struggling much more with this one. I'm finding it much harder. Maybe that's the winter. Maybe it's because we had kind of a novelty piece at the beginning. How are we supposed to cope with all of the demands that we're dealing with at the moment? Work-related, family work, the food, the whole lot. How are we supposed to cope?
It's not easy, for sure. It's not easy. I think what we always have to remember, though, is that there's always been adversity, right? And what we need to remember is the capacity of the human spirit to respond to that. And in fact, I think one of the best books that I've ever read on this is written by Viktor Frankl. It's called Man's Search for Meaning, and essentially it's about when he was in the Holocaust or in a concentration camp during the Holocaust and how he survived it. And actually, just to flag right at the beginning, I've put a number of different books on the last slide of that slide deck that I sent you that people can read. So I think the first thing is there's always been difficulty, always stress. And sometimes there's lots of things that we can't change within that context, but we can always choose our response to stress. And that's what we need to remember. And now, obviously, when there's huge demands, we need to have resources, ideally, to meet those demands. But our resources right now are more limited, so when we're back in the office, we'd have our pals and far greater structure to our day, possibly, and tools and techniques and technology and all of that good stuff that is a great support to responding to demands. Now those resources are way more limited, and really where we're going to get best kind of leverage is within inside ourselves. And so psychology is about the science of human behavior. It tries to understand how, teach and guide people how to access their best selves, if you like. And what we often do is massively underestimate how we're able to dig deep in order to respond to challenges that come our way. And so right now, that's what we have to do, simply because we have fewer kind of external resources to rely on. So we need to rely on our internal resources. And that's where this whole topic of resilience rests. And what is great about the whole topic of resilience is there's donkey's years of research to tell us that we can develop resilience. You're not born with it necessarily. And so resilience, or the way that I'm going to talk about it, is under the framework of what's called psychological capital. So like we've got economic capital, like our assets. We've got human capital, which is what we know, like our own kind of skills, education, experience, that type of thing. Got social capital, which is who we know. But inside ourselves, we have psychological capital, and that refers to a positive sense of capacity to grow and develop and flourish. Actually, Maureen Gaffney, some of your listeners might have heard of Maureen Gaffney. She's professor of psychology in Trinity, and she wrote a book called Flourishing a few years ago. And it's a great exposition, I suppose, of this whole psychological capital domain. So I might just get into what that is then, will I?
Yeah,
so
please.
Yeah, okay. Am I going too fast, or is this okay?
No, perfect, perfect. Okay. I'm about to learn how to
psychological capital, there are 4. Okay, yeah, dig deep. There's 4 components to it: hope, efficacy, resilience, and optimism. And the 4 of those are malleable in that you can develop them, and you can develop a bottomless pit of these 4 components of psychological capital. There's no end point, there's no full component to it. You can build them forever. So let's just go through what they are. So hope in the first instance, and this is not just hoping to God that things change, hoping that we get a vaccine, hoping that things become better. It's not that at all. It's actually about taking ownership of events that you can control. It's about having a sense of agency and perseverance. It's about actually goal setting. Now, the thing with goals, we've all heard of SMART goals: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. And they're all really effective characteristics of good goals, because goals guide behavior. Now, the thing with goals is that we have to obviously tailor our goals to the reality that we find ourselves in. Realistic goals, small goals. This is always what I say to people. Like, nobody ever jumped to the top of Kilimanjaro. It was one footstep in front of the next. And that's the kind of mindset, that kind of vision we should have of our goals.
Nobody ever lost a stone in 2 days.
Nonsense. You have to have realistic goals that are achievable. And the thing is that when you progress through a mapping system that you might have kind of mapped out for yourself, it gives you a tremendous amount of satisfaction. Now, the goal has to be a small goal, but you have to recognize that you achieved the goal. That's the important thing. Far too often people focus on what they didn't get done as opposed to what they did get done. Whereas if you take off what you do get done over the course of a day, at the end of a week, you've got a stack of things to look back on as evidence of, I accomplished something. So hope is about setting goals. It's about identifying pathways to goals. So it's not just randomly thinking, well, I need to get this done. It's about, how am I going to get this done? And persevering while you see your way through that pathway. And the agency piece is about recognizing, I can do this. So agency involves what's called self-referential talk. Basically using the word I'm able to do this. I will now take on this task. I will give myself 40 minutes to do it. So it's about I. So those 3 components of agency, pathways, and goals is what underpins the concept of hope. So you can see it's not a random hoping that something happens. It's actually an action-oriented strategy for achieving tasks that we give ourselves. And that's what hope is. And then the second part of psychological capital is efficacy. And efficacy refers to a person's belief that they're actually going to be able to do something about the challenges that come down the road. And it's completely linked to the goal setting element of hope, because it's about taking a step towards actually doing something. And when you do that, you give yourself a sense of accomplishment, which builds your confidence. What that does is stack up your recognition of your competence, and that that kind of energizes you to take a further step. So hope and efficacy are completely linked with each other.
And presumably the efficacy then is also dependent on the goals being realistic and achievable.
Exactly. And the thing is that once you have, I mean, a lot of people talk about self-esteem and you know, say nice things to yourself and recognize that you're a valuable individual, and that's a good thing. But actually what gives you far more kind of solidity in terms of your self-belief in your capacity to do things is actually having done things. So it's not other people telling you you're fabulous, it's you looking at your track record of what you've got done, and that really fosters a sense of self-belief, which enables you then to take on the next task and the next task. So those two, hope and efficacy, they're the first two components of psychological capital. And both of those are within everybody's bandwidth to adopt, to implement, and to see the results from. And that brings us to the third point, which is resilience. So as I was saying, and actually I should say that these four components of psychological capital, they're not new in the psychological literature. You know, they have been around for donkey's years, and there's tremendous amount of good research establishing the veracity of these concepts and the meaningfulness of them and the value of them. So they're not just kind of pop psychology things at all. They've been around in the literature for a long time. And so that brings me to resilience. And resilience really is about the belief in your capacity to respond to adversity. And this is what we're all feeling at the moment. You know, there's so much going on that we actually can't tackle. It's beyond our control, but we can tackle our mindset. And that's what resilience is all about. Now, building resilience, how do you do that? Well, there are three things. One is how you think. I mean, our thoughts determine our behavior. And if you've got a kind of a negative kind of inner thought pattern going on, well, then that's the nature of your world. Whereas if you take ownership of actually how you're thinking, tuning in really to the kind of temperature of your thought patterns, you can identify where you may be disenfranchising yourself with respect to negative thoughts over positive thoughts. So it actually is anchored in psychotherapy, in cognitive behavioral therapy, which is all about taking note of your thoughts and realizing the connection between your thoughts and your behaviors. And the thing is that often we think in a very unfavorable to self manner. We generalize, we catastrophize, we engage in black or white thinking, like everything is good or everything is bad. And the chances are that none of those thoughts are actually an accurate reflection of reality. But if we don't kind of check our thoughts, if we don't kind of interrogate, well, is that an accurate interpretation? Is it an accurate, is it the only kind of interpretation of what I'm feeling? That then allows you open up another door to look at things a bit differently. And the ABCDE model that's there on the slide takes you through exactly that process. So you check your thoughts and you ask yourself, well, is that the only way of thinking about it? Can I dispute the explanation of an event that I've given myself such that I can see a new light, a new way of looking at something? And that, what it does is allow you an alternative, favorable to self manner of looking at things that may in fact have as much validity as what you thought was the original kind of state of play.
It's interesting because 99% of the people who are listening to us today are lawyers.
Mhm.
And by our nature, we tend to be perfectionists. We tend to be very hard on ourselves. But we also are trained to challenge, to challenge facts, to challenge what we're told, to challenge each other. And actually what you're saying is resonating with me, because we should be challenging our own thoughts as well, and pushing back. And if something's negative, trying to find the positive. And as you say, and it goes back to the other kind of 4 categories as well: be realistic, but pat yourself on the back for the goals that you've achieved, rather than focusing on the couple that you didn't.
For sure.
They're all kind of
and
intertwined.
And also drawing on the fact that everybody's a lawyer who's watching. Obviously, a key element in your business is evidence. So by the same token, when you are, well, firstly, if you don't even interrogate your thoughts to ask yourself, are they accurate? When you do interrogate your thoughts and ask yourself, are they accurate? You have to say, well, where's the evidence? On what basis am I concluding that this is how things are? And so this
And where could somebody else pick holes in that?
Oh, totally. And in fact, that's what a sounding board is for, really, which is, so a second part of building resilience is your relationships with other people, and maintaining those. And the purpose of other people in terms of resilience is specifically to pick holes in your perspective and offer you an alternative way of looking at things, and obviously for them to give you 2 forms of support: emotional support and instrumental support. And then the third element of building resilience, and this is a major feature that people overlook: know your strengths. You know, we so regularly have a heap of stack of encyclopedias on our weaknesses, and there's a good reason to be aware of our weaknesses. You know, they can be a red flag to something going wrong that absolutely you can pay attention to and adjust. But so few people know their strengths. And the thing is that we build on our strengths. There's a great book called Strengths Finders. Simple. And I often get people to try and write out on a sheet of paper, like literally write out what your strengths are. Because what they do is give you a sense of power. When you have an acknowledgement, when you can acknowledge and also give yourself evidence for these strengths, you know, which makes them which reinforces them even more so. You provide yourself with a platform for growth, a platform of strength, a platform of power. And there's a theory called appreciation of resources. And what that draws attention to is the more aware we are of the resources at our disposal, the more they come to the fore in times of difficulty and provide an engine for responding to that difficulty. Whereas if we're not kind of conscious of our strengths and are far too much kind of overwhelmed or pay more attention to all our deficits, well, you don't have a very rich platform for growth then. And the thing is that you don't just have a whole load of weaknesses, you have a whole load of strengths as well. And so the third part of building resilience is really knowing your strengths.
And the fourth element then, Melrona, is optimism. And
yes,
you and you say all of these can be learnt. I
yes,
try to be a glass half full kind of a person. I can feel it dipping at the moment, and sometimes. But can you teach yourself to go from being a glass half empty to being a glass half full person?
You sure can. And this is based on the work of Professor Marty Seligman, and he was actually president of the American Psychological Association a number of years ago. And he put his theme of office, if you like, positive psychology. And so this connects to Maureen Gaffney's book as well. His book was called Learned Optimism. And actually, I've given you a reference for that on the last slide as well. Now, the thing is, optimism is not necessarily going around with a smile on your face. That's not what he means. It's about how you explain things to yourself. So it's a positive explanatory style. And it works like this. An optimist is somebody, when things go well, own their role in making that go well. A pessimist, yes, but a pessimist, when things go well, will connect that to fluke, look, I was on a great team. In other words, they don't plant themselves inside the success. And so they lose the opportunity for flourishing. So if you own yourself, and also it's not just own what you did that, you know, rendered the project a success, but it's own the fact that it's a core characteristic within you that led to your behavior that contributed to the success. And what that reminds you of is that this is an enduring characteristic within you that is always available for contributing to every other situation that comes along. So you can learn to scrutinize how you explain success and failure to yourself. So if we look at failure, what the optimist does in the situation of failure is recognize that the reality of how we all work is very few of us work independently. We're all part of a team, multiple teams simultaneously on an ongoing basis. And so when things go wrong, the optimist remembers that. And what they do is remember that, yes, they may have dropped the ball somewhere, but it's really very difficult to ever categorically and exclusively connect one action with the failure of a project because there's multiple stakeholders in the project. And they remember that. Whereas the pessimist, when there's failure, they suck it up. They own it. I'm useless. I shouldn't have bothered. Why am I in this business at all? They utterly lose themselves in the toxicity of failure, failing to maintain perspective, maintain balance, all of that type of a thing. And so when we find ourselves with something not going wrong, or sorry, something going wrong, what we have to do again is ask ourselves, okay, well, you know, all the different people involved, all the different events, I can see where I dropped the ball, but that does not land the whole failure on me. And that is the difference between a positive or favorable to self-explanatory style versus the negative, unfavorable to self-explanatory style of pessimism. And that's how optimism is learned.
And you can see then how they're all intertwined, because if you can share and own some of the successes on the good things, and you get some optimism from that, that gives you hope, and that feeds into the efficacy, and then that helps with your resilience.
Exactly. They're all inextricably linked, and there's such good evidence that you can build these. And in fact, this type of intervention has been used in a lot of organizations with respect to actually contributing to bottom line profitability, which is quite interesting. But all of these components are utterly within the capacity of everybody to get started on and to map out with respect to how they respond to the difficulties that we're all experiencing on a daily basis. But the thing is that they're all inside us. And so they're all utterly subject to our own management, not reliant on anybody else. It's about how we think. It's about things that we do. It's about setting ourselves tasks. And driving this bottomless pit of psychological capital as a resource to bring to bear when adversity strikes. And it's a question of learning it, and it's a question of habit and putting it into action and building up that habit as an ongoing kind of feature of how you do your thing.
I want to move you slightly, Melrona, because you talked there when you were talking about resilience, and you were talking about relationships with others, and I know we're all doing our best to get out and get some fresh air. And I have a friend that I meet at 4 o'clock on the promenade in Clontarf on a Saturday, and we go for a walk and we catch up and we have a coffee, and that's important, and it's keeping, I think, both of us sane. But I also have all of these relationships in the office, and Mason Hayes and Curran is, as you know, open plan. We're all very close. We're all very interconnected with each other kind of throughout the firm, but particularly in our own teams. And I am missing that so much. I'm missing the chats. I'm missing what you learn by osmosis about the law, about what's going on in the office and in the marketplace. And yes, I am meeting my team virtually. once a week or once a fortnight, you can jump in, and it's not as natural as, you know, hanging on the side of the filing cabinet having the chats. Do you have a view about how we can make it a better experience, how we can enrich the experience, make it closer, make it feel better?
For sure. So there's something called sense of virtual community. And we like to feel part of a community, but now our communities have moved into this virtual space. I think the first thing to remember is that we're all still human beings and have various different needs that we need to, or that we like to have fulfilled. A need for autonomy, a need for competence, but a need for relatedness. And that's the piece that we're missing most specifically in this virtual world. And it really comes down to good communication. I mean, it sounds like such a hackneyed phrase and a catch-all answer to everything, but it is profoundly important. And I suppose we have to lean on extra features of communication now that we're doing it in a virtual world. And so there's the whole component of authenticity of communication. And sharing the fact that it is difficult and that each of us are having our own difficulties, and being able to kind of share that with our team in that virtual space makes us all feel that we're all sharing the load, sharing the burden, and nobody's getting out of this scot-free. Nobody has a pass to get through this in any way. And so what a team leader should really be doing.
Sometimes it's hard as a manager and a leader to know whether you should share, whether you're finding it like, should you be the pillar of optimism all the time, or is it okay to say, jeepers lads, I don't know about you guys, but the days are very short and it's all getting a bit hard. You say it's okay to be human.
I was just going to say that you're a human being and you've got to show that you're a human being. And what that then translates into is permission for the rest of your team to also be human too, and to feel safe in terms of articulating the trials and the tribulations in a manner that is, like within obviously the professional domain, as opposed to getting to sharing all the nitty-gritty details. But there's got to be some degree or some element of humanity and personableness, such that people feel that they're still connected to their team, and that sense of connection is something that carries people through difficult times, because they recognize, okay, we're all in this together, and that there's an acceptance of the fact that life is difficult and that nothing is straightforward and things have to be a bit different. And so I suppose a few other things that team leaders should do is kind of try and back away from micromanaging. It can be quite disconcerting to be managing a team at a distance, and I guess don't fall into the trap of thinking that well, I can't see what they're doing, so I better check in a bit more often. What you have to do is actually give your team choices and voices, meaning that you specify outcomes that are required, not necessarily the process by which something is done. And so that gives people, that kind of ticks the box of people's requirement for autonomy. And if you, as a team lead, can resist the temptation to overly review and thereby avoid a feeling of surveillance in your team members, well, then people rise to that. So autonomy is what drives or kickstarts our sense of motivation. And so specifying just the outcome is probably a better path to take than specifying the process. And I think as well, people's situations are so different and circumstances are so different for people, that, it would fly in the face of expectations to specify the process simply because of the environment people find themselves in, and physically not being able to align themselves with what a team leader might map out as the required process. So you've got to be flexible, you've got to be accommodating, you've got to be connected to people's individual realities, and display your trust in them. Like, trust is a huge thing in any team, but especially so in the virtual world that we find ourselves in. And so trust is built. I put a slide there identifying ways of building trust. And again, it does come down to communication in an enormous way, but also it comes down to sharing aspects of your identity. And so that's what you were saying, you know, sharing the fact that you like to go for coffee at 4 in Clontarf. That's kind of saying who you are. And people enjoy that, and because a huge part of trust is connectedness. So there's this ABCD model of trustworthiness: able, believable, connected, and dependable. And the more you can demonstrate any of those 4 quadrants of behavior, you'll see them on the slide, the more trust grows between people. And that means that the people feel safe, and people are kind of, they're less shackled by their anxieties and can move forward and perform and you know, focus their attention on the task at hand.
It's interesting. A client said to me recently, and a big kind of team in the office. She said to me, that they pivoted completely to being task oriented, and that everybody had their list of things to do, and that she couldn't give a rat's anymore whether they did it between the hours of 9 and 1 and 2 and 6, or whether it took them 2 hours or 8 hours. And she said it was working just as effectively as everybody coming into her beautifully really refurbished offices. Yeah, sure. And I think we all have a shift towards that and that trust. And anybody who is even vaguely cynical about the importance of it before, and I include myself in that a little bit actually, is just organizations, I think, have been astounded at how successful remote working from home. You had a great quote in one of your slides: I'm not working from home. What was it?
Or we're working from home during a crisis. I'm not working from home. We're at home trying to work during a crisis. Yes,
brilliant. Absolutely brilliant.
But actually, something to say there, Melanie, in relation to you know, the flexibility and specifying outcomes. One thing that we are missing is the formal structure of a day in the office that starts at a certain time, finishes at a certain time, whatever they are for different people. And when we're working from home, we have to impose that structure on ourselves. And that's not always an easy thing to do for everybody. Some people are great creatures of habit. But, you know, sow an act, reap a habit, you know, so you start doing something and just keep doing it, it becomes routine. But some people may feel actually it's quite helpful if core hours are specified. It's not for everybody, but for people who find it difficult to discipline themselves into this new arena of working at the kitchen desk or whatever it is, if that's something to consider, because structure helps people manage their day. It also defines the work at home from life at home. And that's a good thing as well, because otherwise everything mushes into the same thing and you can feel like you're never not working. So that's something to think about.
I think I was saying that to you the other day. I spent my first couple of months with the laptop at the dining room table, and my husband was at the kitchen table. And on Friday evenings, I wrapped it all up, the laptop away, put it into press, put away the leads, and hit it, because I needed to stop for the weekend, and I needed the laptops to go away from the spaces that we are having breakfast and lunch and dinner in. Exactly. I'm lucky enough that my husband shut his office, so we got the desks from his office and put them into bedrooms, and I have a space. He's in one of the bedrooms, I'm in a space, and that ability to shut the door or to shut it down and walk away from it, I think lifted a weight off my shoulders, I feel now. Sure. And I appreciate, I'm lucky that I've got a space, but the demarcation and shutting the door, whether it's putting the laptop away on a Friday evening and then taking it back out on Monday morning, or being able to shut the door, or trying to work in a room that you're not sleeping in, or that is, I have found personally that to be so important to me. And I think
absolutely shared. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the definition of space, but the thing as a team lead that you need to be conscious of is not everybody has that.
Yeah.
And so you have to kind of check in, like be curious with respect to team members as to how they're getting on and what's it like for them, and where you have kind of divulged aspects of yourself, people feel it's okay to say the difficult, or okay to name, if you like, the difficulties that they're having too. There's another element that team leaders should think about, and that is something called leave loudly. So if you say, I'm sorry, I'm going for a run at 4 o'clock and that's it, or I'm going to do the shopping at 2:30 because the schools aren't out and it's a window where I can do it quite, that's really important thing to do. Leave loudly. And what that means is people get the message that it's okay for them to leave too. So like leadership is still going to be a core requirement, or effective leadership critical in this domain. And the core leadership skills, like leadership is about influencing people. It's a process. It's not an event. It's an interaction. And so the same kind of behaviors are completely relevant in this context. But there is this additional requirement for richer communication. And obviously we've got all these wonderful tools like Zoom that we will all happily never see the light of once this is all over. But we need to use them. And we need to introduce more of kind of our humanity into that space, for people to remember that they're part of the same team, despite the fact that they're dispersed around the country or wherever they are. And so the team leader needs to kind of set the tone of doing that.
And I get that, and I've seen faces of clients in Denmark and India and the US that I didn't know what it looked like for the last few years. So it has some advantages. But one of the things that strikes me, and one of the things I've heard other people talking about is the team members who are struggling, and we all have the work Zooms. What have you got on today? What have you got to do? And I said my team has tried to do some remote drinks and remote coffees, and some people are more engaged than others. And I think that's an experience of everybody. And this is one of the questions actually that's come up in the Q&A function. What are your tips for encouraging the 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 team members who are kind of more obviously distracted, detached, not getting engaged? And look, it is unnatural for us all to be doing this way rather than, and you don't get the feedback because you can't see people nodding. And what are your tips or tricks for trying to bring in those more detached people, if you like?
Well, again, I guess you have to remember that you don't really know what's going on in their life necessarily, or their house or the room that they're in. You don't have any concept of that. And so really your job as a team lead is to connect with them one-on-one. That would be certainly the first thing to do, really to ascertain, is there anything that's going on that you could actually support them with? Have they some skill deficit? Is there some tech deficit? But also then by you connecting with them one-on-one and getting a sense of what's going on, you then can have an opportunity to allay their fears about what may be inhibiting them from communicating in the group context. But another, like that would be, if you like, the kind of a softer side. Another component would be the establishment of core hours, where there's a requirement to log on or to check in or to attend various different meetings. And the more there is that requirement to do so, people can become a bit more comfortable in doing so. And that builds up this efficacy of, oh, well, I'm able to do this and it wasn't so bad and it went far easier. And so they do it again. But I guess another thing to think about would be, is there a climate in the team that is resulting in, or a culture or a feeling or an atmosphere that is resulting in people being a bit wary of it, a bit scared, a bit threatened, and what could that be? And so if you think in terms of what's called psychological safety, people are far more open then in contributing all sorts of stuff, including the stuff that they're nervous about. And what that really means is, like especially in the virtual community, a big thing is sanctions. So where a team member has been sanctioned in a group discussion, it actually destroys the trust that exists between people. So any kind of sanction of a person on a team virtually has got to be done individually. certainly not in front of the whole group, because there aren't enough, if you like, non-verbal cues that the sanctioned person can pick up from other people that may be supportive and that may be kind of gentle and you know, calm down and that wasn't so bad. And, you know, it's way more difficult because we have an absence of all of that body language and gestures and tone of voice and eye contact and all of those things that soften tough things that have been said.
So you mightn't call out a bad behavior in a group, in a physical group situation. You might be able to give somebody a look or a nod or a glance that would send them a message, and you can't do that virtually, and that makes sense.
Exactly. Yeah. So what that calls for is the team leader to be far more self-aware, far more engaging of their executive function, like their brain, in terms of thinking ahead and recognizing what something might sound like in this context and whether or not. It's just like with text messages, and we're all using emojis to beat the band in order to make sure I was laughing, it was a joke, and it's just very, very difficult to get that across. And so one thing that does destroy trust in the virtual context is sanctioning of individual members.
We have a really good question here, Melrona, that I really like, because we've been talking about dealing with team members who are a little bit detached or distracted, or people who are not, you know, dealing with kind of, I suppose, misbehaviors. But there's a question here, which I like, which is, any tips for helping a leader to deal with feelings of being overwhelmed? What are your tips for dealing with that? Pause the meeting, admit it, like if it's the leader who's feeling overwhelmed.
And you know, it's interesting, like in terms of the leadership research, most of the research focuses on a leader's behavior and their impact on followers, and much less on leader well-being. You know, leadership is about, first and foremost, leadership is about leading yourself. And that means really anchoring yourself inside your own head, stabilizing yourself, taking a deep breath, prioritizing things, mapping out a plan of action. But first and foremost, regrouping, if you like, establishing what am I trying to achieve in this meeting, mapping out a bit of an agenda in advance, but also very much when the person feels overwhelmed, calling that out, stating it, and pushing activities on to the next day or a different agenda or a different team or something like that. I mean, a leader doesn't have to be the dynamic hero in any situation, and they shouldn't really be, because that can blot out everybody else's effort. But a leader has to have realistic expectations of themselves, recognizing that if they are not, you know, capable of giving their best selves, well, how are they going to lead effectively from that? And so any kind of effective leadership of others starts with effective leadership of yourself. And so that's where these psychological activities of developing efficacy, building resilience, managing an optimistic interpretation stands to no end.
Interesting.
And
you know, like I said, 99.99% of the participants in today's webinars are lawyers, and we are kind of, I won't say we're unnatural leaders, but it's not something, you know, when you rock up in UCD or Trinity and the October after you're leaving cert, you get, or DCU or Maynooth or NURG or UL or UCC, or I'm not going to get in trouble now. But you think about being a lawyer, and you think about the law, and then as you progress to different roles in your career, you end up leading and managing, and it's not something that I think we prepare ourselves for at all, or we invest in actually that way.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah,
on our MBA program, we often have lawyers on the MBA program, and that kind of fills that kind of skills gap. But I think as well that lawyers tend to be real high achievers, and there's awful traps involved in being a high achiever. And there's this, you know, pursuit of perfection at all times, and fear of making a mistake. And yeah, I mean, in a lot of situations, the stakes are pretty high, and the risk of a slip is quite significant. And, you know, I'm not going to underestimate that at all. But what people should do really is test their boundaries. you know, people can very quickly, when they are so careful about not making mistakes, can overlook how they can push themselves just that teeny tiny extra little bit in order to produce a huge benefit to themselves. And it was only ever a small step. And that's where efficacy comes in, you know, giving yourself that extra task to do, a small task to do, and deriving the sense of accomplishment and achievement that underpins your capacity to take on another step. But high achievers are notoriously tough on themselves, demanding, and there's work to be done in order to try and kind of manage those kind of pressures that such people put upon themselves.
But then we're back then to your 4 elements of psychological capital being around realistic goal setting, hope, exactly. Efficacy, yeah. And optimism, yeah. and yeah. Stabling and steadying yourself.
Absolutely.
Or you can
steadying yourself. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. There's a great picture that I use when I'm talking about leadership, and it's a ship on a stormy sea, and it's supposed to kind of provoke what leadership is all about. And, you know, a leader has got to be steady within themselves, like the captain of a ship, recognizing that, as I was saying, leadership is not an event, it's a process of interaction with other people. Whereas too many leaders seem to think they're on their own, and they're on a rock, utterly isolated from everybody else, no support around them. Team leaders should connect with other team leaders. Like when you're a senior in a position in an organization, can actually also be quite a lonely place. But all the other peers at that level are feeling the same way, and there can be this kind of reluctance to reach out. Maybe is it going to in some way suggest vulnerability or inadequacy? It's actually just connecting with the reality of life and providing support to your peers around you. So by just as much followers connect, so do leaders need to do that and get a little kind of cohort going.
While you're on the topic of leadership, Melrona, you talked a little bit a while ago about micromanagement and macromanagement, and you talked a little bit about trust. Is there a difference between leadership in the real world, in an office space, in the 4 walls, and virtual leadership? Are there things you think that leaders should do in a virtual world that are slightly different, or what are your top tips around that?
Yeah, I think it may be, you see, it's far easier to communicate the leadership role, let's say, or the leadership function face to face. Far easier because you have all the social cues around you to draw on and to deliver into that interaction. So there's a bigger ask to get that across in a virtual context, but ultimately good leadership is the same. You know, good leadership is where followers trust their leaders. And so even if you use that one slide on the ABCD model of trust, and thinking, how do you demonstrate that you are able? So that comes down to your competence. How do you demonstrate that you are believable, you know, your integrity? How do you demonstrate that you are connected? And so that's you know, literally staying in touch with people, and dependable, like your track record, that people can rely on you. Those things stay absolutely the same. It may be that leaders need to maybe dig a little bit deeper to articulate those things, to really make sure that their team get them. I guess one of the difficulties is if you haven't been an effective leader before now, chances are the odds are stacked against you being effective in this virtual space.
It's not going to change.
What that really means is that there really is an onus on leaders the whole time to ensure that they're demonstrating and contributing the highest quality leadership that they can. I mean, leadership really is a process of influence. That's what it's about. And so influence is brought to bear in a hard and a soft way. There's room for both of those on different occasions, but an effective leader doesn't necessarily come into their own when there's an absence of the human, personal, interpersonal context for influence to flow. So it has to be built up in advance of that. But I mean, core leadership behaviors would be things like inspirational motivation, you know, role modeling, you know, demonstrating the behavior that you want everybody else to demonstrate, not asking people to do stuff that you wouldn't do yourself. Another aspect is what's called individualized consideration. And so that is connecting with your team. And just as you were saying, if one team member doesn't really connect in the virtual space and isn't participating necessarily during Zoom meetings. Well, it's your job as a leader to connect with them and to work out what's going on.
I'm gonna stay on that point, right? Because we've a good few questions, and a couple of them are around that, Melrona. And I've seen this myself. So in the bigger virtual meetings, the same, people are talking all of the time, and there's always a couple. And I know we've already talked about this, but there's some more questions on it. So I'm going to go back there a little bit. How do you bring in the couple of people who are not engaging as a leader? And I know you can ask a direct question. I've done it myself. I've gone to the person who has said nothing and say, well, what do you think? And how are you doing? And blah. And sometimes you get the monosyllabic answer, and then it's shut down again. Do you have tips for the participants in this about how to bring in those as a leader? And
lots of tips. One thing that comes to mind, there's this technique called the 7 hats technique, right? And it was promoted by this guy called Edward de Bono, big guy in creative thinking. And basically what he said was that often meetings are dominated and produce no outcome, no tangible outcome, because people are not thinking in the same way at the same time. In other words, an idea is presented and it's shot down, and that's the end of that. And nobody else, because the person who has shot it down may be quite a powerful person in the room, nobody takes them on, and nobody disagrees with them. And so de Bono says that so many ideas and so many possibilities, like if discussions are shut down, so many possibilities are missed. So he said the first thing to do is to make sure people are thinking in the same direction at the same time. And he used different color hats, figuratively, to reflect the different forms of thinking. So an idea is put out. So you're saying to your team, what do you think about that? And he would say, okay, tell them all to put on the yellow hat. In other words, what's good about this? Everybody's thinking in that direction at the same time. Okay, we've done with the yellow hat, let's put on the black hat. Who doesn't like this? And that's your opportunity to create space for people who didn't answer with the yellow hat to say something with the black hat on. And one thing that's really important is to be able to deal with silence. People hate silence, and they will shut something down or move on rather than just let silence be there. So as a leader, a really key skill is to be able to be silent. And what is hilarious, and I've done this so often with some of my students, is I've asked them to close their eyes for a minute and open their eyes when they think a minute is up. And people get to like 22 seconds. And 34, they think it's a minute because they think, oh, this is so uncomfortable. I hate being silent. And so to be able to create silence, because that allows things to be said and doesn't move the discussion along. So you've got the yellow hat, you've got the black hat, you've got the red hat, which is emotion. How do you feel about this? Do you love it? Do you hate it? And then the green hat, which is, well, what could we add onto this? And so what this means is that you've defined a way of thinking. Everybody's thinking in that way at the same time, and you've created different ways of thinking which kind of open up. Well, you spoke with the yellow hat, or you didn't speak with the yellow hat. Have you got something to say with the black hat on? And so it kind of equalizes the participation. But I think a leader very much has to demonstrate curiosity, and also and this is a big part of psychological safety, demonstrate their fallibility. So a leader should be saying things like, oh, look, I'm sure I'm missing something here. And maybe that's where you would go to the person in the room who is the newest. You could say, look, you're new in the door. You haven't seen any of this stuff before. You would see things in a new light. What do you think about this? But what is really important is that how people's contributions to discussions is received is critical. If there's a hint of criticism, hostility, blame, ridicule, well, then you've destroyed the whole atmosphere. And so that the leader's role is to champion that psychologically safe atmosphere where it's safe to say something and nobody's contribution is stupid or to be ridiculed, but it's rich in that it can be a building block to something else. So I think managing the thinking process is very valuable technique.
There's another interesting question here, and it's somebody who's clearly a team member who says, what about the team leader who sets up the Zoom for once a month and talks at everybody and then shuts it down? As a team member, how do you try and foster a little bit of engagement with your leader when with other people in the team? Because there's another question there about how important it is kind of across team engagements as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, you know, what all of this points to is the need for attention to team dynamics 24/7, such that when this disaster strikes, we're not all flailing around wondering how to connect with our team and, you know, feeling comfortable with our team members and all the rest. Where you have a leader who operates like that, I guess what you'd be wondering is, well, is this out of keeping with their behavior back at the office? Because if it's still in keeping with how they behave in the office, have you got unrealistic expectations of their behavior in the virtual office environment? So that would be something to think about. If it's completely out of keeping with how they operate in the office, well, then maybe you should be thinking, what's up? And if something is so different, well, a leader is a person too. And so why not shoot them off a little email and say, is everything okay? So trying to kind of square behavior with accurate expectations such that you can pick up if things are, you know, have gone off track altogether or not, would be a good place to start. But leaders are human too.
One final question. We've had the interest is phenomenal. Fail better. Can you comment on that? What is fail better?
Fail better means learn from the failure. You know, too often we can shut the door and put the lid on the box and move on and forget about it. But failure is such a rich learning opportunity. What were the antecedents to the failure? Where could you intervene? What could you have done differently to set it off on a different tangent the next time? If we don't learn from failure, we miss an enormous opportunity for growth. And that's what that means.
To avoid making the same mistake twice. Melrona, this has been fascinating. I can't believe we're an hour into it already. Thank you so much. I have learned loads, and I hope our participants have as well. I really appreciate you taking the time. Thanks to everybody who tuned in. Like I said, that was our last masterclass, but we have our Financial Services Insight series scheduled for Wednesday, the 2nd of December, and that's with Martin Wolf, and you can register on mhc.ie. Thank you everybody for tuning in. Melrona, thank you again. Thank you, Sive, for helping us set this up. And is it a bit early to wish people a happy Christmas? I think if you haven't put the trees up, which we haven't done yet in our house, you can't wish happy Christmas yet. But I hope that the lead into it is easier on everybody and everybody gets their shopping done. And good luck, everybody. Thank you.